You know, we get questions sometimes about propane. Here's our lovely propane tank. And sometimes the questions are, isn't it kind of a defeating the purpose of being off the grid to use propane? And why not just use electricity for these things?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what we're going to talk about in this week's episode.
The Ready Life, into the country.
Hi, I'm Lisa Meisner.
And I'm Nick, her husband.
Welcome back to the Ready Life podcast, where you'll get the essential tools you need to make your home and your family as independent as possible for your basic necessities like water, heat, food, and the power that so many of us depend on these days. Today's podcast, we're going to be talking about propane.
That's right. This is a question that comes up periodically. Folks wondering, you know, that they've heard about folks that live off the grid using propane. A lot of folks use propane. Anybody in a rural setting might use propane, but we're often getting questions about, is that really a good option? Is it super expensive? And how about the independence side of things? What is that good, being dependent upon fuel that you have to purchase? Why not just go totally electric and make your own power off the grid? And so I guess that's kind of the first thing we should mention, is that elephant in the room of the whole independence side of things.
We get that question so often.
Right. And so it's true. And propane, unless you have a gas well on your property and a processing plant to turn it into propane or natural gas, then this is not a renewable source of energy or of fuel, and you do have to buy it. So from that standpoint, yes, it is correct that this is not a renewable source. But there are reasons why I'm okay with us using it. And one of the biggest reasons why is because we treat propane as a convenience. And that's what I tell folks is, with your use of propane, if you treat it as a convenience and make sure that you have alternate backup ways of dealing with those things, then it's no problem. It enables you to live a normal life, a very convenient life, the way that you're used to, and it can dramatically, using propane instead of electricity for certain appliances, can dramatically cut the size and the cost of your off-grid power system. And so I'm referring specifically to the big four appliances.
Yes.
And what would those be?
So the big four appliances are going to be your stove or oven and range, your clothes dryer, your hot water heater, and then the last one would be your heating and cooling, your HVAC system. Those would be the big four, and they use a ton of power from an electricity standpoint.
I don't think the word ton does it justice. I think massive is more, I don't know. You get the idea. It's a huge amount of power. And so just to put this in perspective a little bit, we would have to, so our off-grid power system, if we were to replace it right now, would probably be less than $20,000. And if we were to be fully electric for all of those items, it would probably be closer to $60,000, maybe even $80,000 to build a system big enough to power those items. And by using propane we use propane for 3 items: for heating our water, for cooking our food, and for drying our clothes. We use wood for heating, and that's totally the way to go, in my opinion. But for those other 3 items, we do use propane, and by using propane for those 3 items, we have saved ourselves potentially
tens of thousands of
tens
dollars.
of thousands, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was like $40,000 or more. And so it makes the whole off-grid thing way more feasible when you can cut the cost of your system. And it's not just the upfront cost right now, it's also on down the road, because while your solar panels and inverters and stuff like that can last a long, long time. Batteries do wear out eventually. And so, in 15 years, you may need to replace those batteries. And if you've had to build this massive system to power all of this electric stuff, then your cost to replace those batteries is going to be massive in 15 years. Whereas the cost to replace our batteries in 15 years is just a fraction of that.
Yeah.
So it's just a much, much more cost-effective way of doing things.
And I thought it was interesting, like for our propane, we have 1,000-gallon tank here. And it took us a couple of years to get it topped off, but once we get it topped off, we just make sure that we refill it every single year.
At the end of the summer when gas is the cheapest.
Because that's
for propane.
Yeah, it's just cheaper. And so we just save every month and then we refill it at the cheapest price. But we use, how much do we use?
Let's see what's in here right now. So we are at about 67% or so. And that goes right along with what we've calculated in the past. When they fill up a propane tank, they'll fill it up to about 80%. If you're past the peak of the summer and it's going to be cool weather ahead, then they might even take it up to 85. But this is right in keeping with that we use about 2.5% per month, which works out to
roughly $50 a month.
$50 a month is what we come up with at the high cost of propane now.
Yeah.
Which it's doubled. I don't remember exactly what it was, but I think if memory serves me right, I think it's almost doubled in the last several years.
It has.
And so even in spite of that, we're still at somewhere in the neighborhood of $50 a month. And that $50 a month or $600 a year, that has saved us $40,000 or more probably in the cost of our power system. And so at the current price of propane, it'd take, I think I figured it up as being about 60 years to recover the cost, that $40,000 by, if we were to go completely electric and not use propane, the $600 a year factored out, it would take like 60 years to recover that $40,000 that we saved. So it's just a much, much more cost-effective way of doing things and makes it feasible for someone like us to do this, where otherwise it would not be feasible.
And then going back to like the independence question, which we get a lot, propane isn't 100% independent. And it's like, well, no, you can't, replenish your own fuel tank from your own resources on your property, perhaps. But with 1,000-gallon propane tank, first of all, we have, because it's a larger storage, we have, 3 years?
Almost 3 years supply at our current usage.
Yeah.
That's even if we didn't go into emergency mode.
But like he mentioned, we have 3 major appliances that we use propane for, and that's our clothes dryer, our oven and stove, and then our water heater. But, if we had to go into conservation mode, that's really easy because, if you think about it, for many years after we first got married, I didn't even have a dryer. And so I was just hang drying all of our clothes. So I still have all of our racks for hang drying. And, if we needed to cut back on our propane usage for whatever reason, then out come the clothes racks. And then we just hang dry our clothes. Then for like cooking and baking, I can easily cook on our wood stove. It's not a wood cook stove, which is what we eventually plan to get and have in our new home when we rebuild. But right now, even just with our smaller wood stove, I still cook and dehydrate stuff on it all the time. And so if I needed to cut back on propane, I could just easily start cooking over on the wood stove more often. And as far as the oven goes, during the summertime, we actually have a solar oven that I could use. But the third thing was the hot water. And of course, hot water, gotta say, is really nice. That'd probably be the one that we would, the last thing to go, the last thing to cut back on. But even still, you take a shorter shower, or you could heat water on the wood stove to use for some things, just to start cutting back on the propane usage. And in that kind of a situation, this propane would last us for years and years.
Long time.
So,
and propane doesn't go bad.
Yeah.
So
there's options. And Nick mentioned earlier that we use propane as kind of a convenience or a luxury. And it really is. We have other options that we could do if we had to cut back on or cut out propane altogether. So I think that's something to think of too when you're thinking about, the independence side of things. You can still be independent and enjoy the conveniences and luxuries that we have in our modern society today.
Right. The goal is, or at least our goal, is not necessarily to live like folks in the 1800s. Our goal is to be as independent as possible, and while still living a comfortable lifestyle. And so if we can accomplish both of those things, then we're good with it. And that's why we use propane. It makes financial sense from a financial standpoint. It makes independence sense. No, like we've already mentioned, it's not the purest, ideal way to be completely 100% sustainable, renewable, whatever you want to call it. But it gives us a tremendous amount of independence, years of independence, and while still maintaining our current lifestyle. And it's just been a win-win for us. So another thing that I wanted to mention was above ground versus below ground. You see, we have an above ground tank. The only reason we have an above ground tank here is because it was here when we bought the place, and we plan on rebuilding. We were very seriously considering putting an underground tank in a number of years ago when we were having some wildland fire issues around here, and but we decided to wait because we are planning to rebuild in the not too distant future, and we'll want the propane tank in another spot, and so when we do that, then we'll put the propane tank underground.
Yes.
And the turkeys are getting really noisy if you hear them in the background. They can be noisy little critters every now and then. Anyhow, so that's as far as above ground versus below ground. Now, another thing is rented versus purchased. You can often rent tanks from the propane company for not much, probably $100 or less per year.
Yeah.
And that may be a great solution for you. In our case, this tank was rented when we bought the place, so it was not owned by the property owner. And so we'd made the decision to continue on with renting it because we plan on buying our own underground tank in the future. If we were going to stick with this above ground tank, though, I would just buy it. And here's why. First of all, that eliminates the potential that if you couldn't pay for the rent in a particular year, that they would come and take your tank. But secondly, it also makes it where you can buy your propane from any source.
Yeah.
When you're renting a tank from a company, you have to buy propane from them. But if you own the tank, then you can shop around and you can find
the cheapest price
of propane. And so we do that once a year. We wait till the end of the summer when propane is the cheapest, and we top off our tank once a year. Now, I will say, if you have a generator that runs off of propane, which, by the way, is a great idea. I think that propane is a great fuel option for generators. Just realize that generators do drink a lot of gas. And so if you're running a propane generator any considerable amount, you're going to be using a lot more propane than we do. And so don't expect that your 1,000-gallon tank is going to last 3 years if you're running the generator regularly with that. And let's see, what's the other?
The last thing I could think of would be like a backup propane heater in your home. Like if you wanted to go on an extended trip and you're in a cooler climate where you need to keep the house from freezing, then a backup propane heater might be an added benefit, which we do have one actually in our home. We rarely ever use it, but
And I don't recommend we have a direct vent propane heater, but it is purely just a backup heater. I don't recommend it as a primary heater. It's for keeping your house from freezing up if you go on a trip in the winter, that kind of thing. But for heating, we mentioned a wood stove. There's nothing like wood heat, honestly.
it's true.
And if I was not sold on it before, a couple of weeks ago sold me completely. I was already sold on it, but it just double sold me when we were 24 below and people's power was going out and natural gas was going down and this and that. And it was like, man, there's nothing like wood heat. And whenever we stay with family or friends that have a central heating and air system, it's so cold.
Breathe.
And with wood, it's like we keep it somewhere around 80 degrees in our house all winter long. And it doesn't really, we burn a little more wood, but what is that? It's just a little more work for us going out and gathering a little bit more firewood, and it's awesome. So I highly recommend wood heat. If you don't use it as your primary, at least have a wood stove as a backup. But there I go, getting sidetracked on wood heat. It's just been kind of heavy on our minds lately.
Yeah.
But propane, it's a great tool if used properly. But once again, my advice to you would be don't get yourself dependent on propane. Refrigerators. Oh, that's the other thing I wanted to bring up was propane refrigerators. You may not be aware of this, but there are companies that make propane refrigerators that run off of propane where they're non-electric or use almost no power. And that at one time was a really popular thing for folks who were off the grid because, wow, this is great. I can, in the days when their systems were really teeny tiny, really expensive, it was like, this is a way that I can eliminate one of my power users during the wintertime and use propane. Personally, now you could do that, and you totally could do that. But personally, I feel like you reach the point of diminishing returns with a propane refrigerator. You can get such energy efficient electric refrigerators these days where I just don't think it's worth it to use a propane refrigerator. Just get yourself an efficient electric one. You're using free electricity from the sun to power it and be done with it. That would be my advice. But the overarching thing here is don't get yourself dependent on propane. Make sure you treat it as a luxury or a convenience and be prepared to live without it if you needed to. So that's what we have to say about propane. Hope it's been helpful, and we'll see y'all next week.
Bye.
Bye now.